encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. If you want to be a serious Bible student, a successful servant, and a powerful preacher, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome to Preachers in Training. My name is Robert Hatfield, and this is the podcast on which we discuss all things preaching and ministry. We want to welcome you to Season 16, Episode 1, and I ought to say, welcome back to Season 16. We've taken our annual summertime break, and we're back with a brand new season of content. I have pre-recorded several episodes, and you're going to be really interested in these. I can't wait to share them with you in the weeks to come. But today, we're kicking off by the way, all listener requests this season, and here's the first one. We're talking about contemporary issues, and here to help us discuss that today is Dr. Matthew Sokoloski, affectionately known as Soko in these parts.
Yes.
Associate Professor of Bible and Humanities. I was looking for your official title at Freed-Hardeman University. Welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on your podcast.
Oh, this is fun. It's like, it feels like this. Well, you want to be on my podcast? Like I'm some kind of, anyway, this is good.
Well, I'm happy to. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you. Matt and I work together through the Henderson Church of Christ as well, because you're our campus minister, and that's fun too. Mm-hmm. So thanks for all you do. You teach courses related to contemporary issues. In fact, that may be the course title.
Yes.
Okay.
I actually teach a class that's called Contemporary Concerns. So,
okay.
Yeah. And so that is a class in which what I've tried to do with that class is the first half of the semester really look at issues that our culture at large is talking about, but maybe we're not talking a lot about as much in the church. And then the second half, kind of some of the more traditional things that you might think of. So initially, like, again, those some of those broader issues of, social justice, sexual ethics, politics a bit. And then,
so we're hearing a lot about those things in the news, and that's what you're wanting.
Right, like critical race theory, right? Yeah. Everybody hears critical race theory. Do they know what it is? And so we try to engage some of those issues and think about them biblically, so that they're prepared to kind of engage those.
I see.
Because, I find a lot of times they're talking about it with their friends, but they, to have a place to have a conversation that's facilitated and trying to point them to some good resources and to think through biblically those things. And then the second half, looking at things like musical instruments in worship, women's roles, church leadership, baptism, Lord's Supper, those, we kind of go through some of those things as well. Just to it's easy. Maybe we assume that they,
right.
they know these things, but one of the things I found is that really a lot of folks, they may be convicted by it, but they don't necessarily know why, right? And so it's more of, well, this is how we've always done it. And so I want to make sure those convictions hold. And so I want to go and show, look, how is this rooted in God's word? And how does that shape our thinking so that we don't, just drift with whatever culture or tradition says?
That's great. And, it's interesting how some of those issues, even though they're, as old as the first century, and have roots even beyond that, of course, are contemporary issues in and of themselves, right? I mean, it's very much at play in the modern conversation. That's interesting. I think it's important for preachers to sort of understand these things, and I view you as kind of somebody who's on the front lines, right? I mean, you're molding the young minds of the future.
Hopefully doing it. Hopefully, it's a big task, responsibility.
Yeah, but in many ways, I mean, I've seen this to be true. You kind of keep a finger on the pulse of what college students are thinking or wrestling with. Generally, then that makes its way into the thinking and the conversations of the general congregation within a few years.
Right.
I view this as an important conversation for us preachers today, just because we need to understand this so that we can encourage and participate in the conversation. And also, as we go, I know we're going to talk about not just what we say, but how we say it. And I think that's half the battle. So I'm looking forward to the conversation here. What have you learned about the issues that young Christians are facing today? Let me ask you first, how many semesters now have you taught this course, Contemporary
So
Concerns?
this course comes around once a year. I just finished my second year at Freed-Hardeman, so I've taught it now twice.
Okay. And what are you learning about, where these students are or the issues that they're facing?
Well, I would say not just in that class, but I also teach a Foundations for Faith class. I teach Christian Evidences.
Yeah.
And what I've started to do is I have a faith reflection at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester.
All right, tell me what that is.
Okay, so initially I just ask them like, why do you believe or not believe, or what do you struggle with? And I really leave it like wide open, and it's a short reflection. It's not a research project or anything. And I tell them, I say, look, you don't have to pour out your heart and soul in this. Like if, just whatever you want to do. I said, now I'll be the only one that reads them and all of that. But I find that a good majority of them really do. I mean, there's a lot of transparency, or if you ask, that they open that up in that way. And I would just say that it's like each semester I am amazed by that. And even though they're short little writings, they take a long time because and sometimes I'm like weeping, because these students, I think one of the things that you might think that, well, it looks like a homogenous group, or just kind of, we make some assumptions about their backgrounds and where they're coming from, and just to realize just how diverse their stories are. And yes, you do have those that were there every time the church doors were open, but you have people, even those folks who are dealing with tremendous challenges. And I've found that, for many of them, they've never been asked to reflect on their faith in that way. And so some of them kind of stumble around a little bit like, well, when you just pause now, well, why is it that you believe, or what is it that you struggle with? And so then I do that again at the end of the semester, and I kind of tweak it a little bit, incorporate some things that we maybe have talked about. And so I think it's just to not make assumptions about people. And this is just classic, for every generation.
But especially a place like Freed-Hardeman, you're sort of assuming people are coming from a certain background.
Right.
And that even they're there at an institution like that for the same purposes.
Right.
Which isn't always the case.
Right. And some love being there, want to be there. Maybe some are like, well, my parents maybe come. But I think regardless, what you find is that we all struggle with sin in different ways, and how we overcome that, how we grow in our faith. And I've found that while there's spiritual immaturity in the sense that they're just on the cusp of adulthood. So I don't mean that insulting in any sort of way, but I also find a lot of spiritual maturity in the sense that I've found them to be, they want help and guidance, and so to help them think through that. And I want them to have the light bulb moment themselves. I really try, especially like in these classes, that it's not just like, hey, this is the answer. And you've got, like I tell them, you don't get your grade because you agree with me. Like, and you need to show your arguments. Now, what we ultimately want to do is that I'm not right about everything either. Right. And I can be mistaken. So what we all want to do, what we want to hold up is God's word. And we say, that's our anchor. And so let's come back there, and we might disagree about some things in that regard, but let's keep going back to God's word.
You mentioned some of the contemporary concerns, the specific issues that you spend in that first half of the semester discussing and addressing. To what extent do those faith reflections help you to determine what those topics have been or will be, as opposed to, obviously just, keeping a finger on the pulse in the culture has to do something.
I would say that because, I like to know what I'm going to do every class day at the beginning of the semester.
You're a planner.
That's kind of my
approach. Which is good to hear.
So it doesn't so much change like the content or structure, but I think it can inform the way that I approach these things, right? Because if I understand where people are coming from, then I can be sensitive to those things. Because again, we've talked about this before. It's not always like what you say, but also how you say it. Right. And again, you can say it as respectfully as possible, and somebody can still be offended. But how can I, to the best of my ability, make sure that I'm trying to, like 1 Peter 3:15, give an answer, but also do it with gentleness and respect.
Yeah. Are students coming out and using terminology like critical race theory, or do you think that maybe, Based on what they're saying here, I'm realizing that they have a fundamental misunderstanding of this concept or that concept.
It depends because you get all kinds,
Yeah,
in class. But I would say, generally speaking, they're probably just like any other average person. They've maybe heard these terms, but they don't really know what it means or how to engage it. And so that's what I'm trying to do is I always tell them, like, there are a lot of layers to this onion. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in this course, what we're going to do is, like, we're not going to get to the core on each of these things, but what I want to do is I want to expose you so that you kind of have a starting place, like get a lay of the land, so that you can then think about and reflect on these things and engage on them later.
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned some of these issues, and some of these are things that I know maybe people who are listening to this podcast today, we're all, mostly preachers here. We're concerned about these things, the use of instruments in worship, in terms of singing, the taking of the Lord's Supper, women's roles in the church. And then, like to your point, some of the political issues or the issues that have been politicized. It can be a little discouraging, I think, maybe, and sometimes overwhelming. I mean, you mentioned college students don't often know what to think about. I mean, sometimes we don't know as adults, like what the right answers are, or even what the proper definitions of things are. You think you know, but you don't. So anyway, I guess I'm just sharing woes for a moment. I'm airing grievances. But that can be hard stuff to deal with.
Well, and I think, like, there is that pessimistic side in a way in which you think about the messages that our younger generations are bombarded with, and in the sense that, like, how much we are influenced by our culture. But then I think on the other side, like, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so, like, we're still, like, God remains the same, and His Word remains the same, and we struggle like every generation struggles. I mean, if you get down on yourself, go read some of the epistles and some of the things they were struggling with. And I think that puts it in perspective of to not be discouraged, but to, just to realize, there are challenges, but we can still, again, try to point them towards God.
Keep preaching truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't go wrong with that.
Yeah.
What do you think it is that's causing younger Christians, or Christians for any age for that matter, to depart from the truth on some of these subjects or topics?
Well, again, kind of like I said earlier, if they might, feel convicted about something, and then they go out and they start to see a lot of different options, and they might not feel as convicted anymore, right? And not understand why. And so that goes back to the thing of, like, I mean, you talk about your feelings all day, but tell me what you think, right? Like in the sense of, again, it's this, a lack of conviction. And so that's one of the things that I try to do and come across and say, instead of it like, here is the answer from me on high, like setting me up as the authority, saying, all right, look, here's God's word, and here's why I am convicted of this, and let me share that with you, right? And so that invites them into a dialogue instead of like, I'm the authority figure, instilling in them. And instead, it's putting us on an even playing field of, hey, look, and usually in my classes, we can agree that we want to go to God's word. For most, that's not the case out in the world, but then that becomes a way in which we're investigating that together. And so I think, it can just become traditional or sentimental. And so we want to kind of ground their thinking too, to that really root their conviction when their feelings, they falter. And I think that those that are convicted, they also recognize the need to better communicate these things as well. And so I think that's a big thing of talking about, I find a lot of them are convicted, but it's like, but we're not doing a good job talking about it. So I think that's the other thing. We want to anchor folks, and then we also want to think about method too. I actually was thinking through this, I already mentioned 1 Peter 3:15 about to do it with gentleness and respect. A lot of times we like giving the answer, but the way in which we do it, Colossians 4:5-6, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. I love 2 Corinthians 5, 5:18 talk about the ministry of reconciliation. Verse 20 talks about being ambassadors. Like I constantly come back to that. That really roots a lot of my thinking. And again, 2 Timothy 2:24 and 26, the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. So it's like that. Again, if we start to think of people as captured by Satan, then it maybe softens some of because I mean, we just don't know how to have civil discourse.
Yes.
And we can let our emotions take the best of us. And so really we talk a lot about, and I always bring up in class, you want to, it's not about winning an argument. You want to win the person, right? You can win an argument and lose the person. In fact, I brought some books.
Good.
Now I have no benefit from recommending these. Okay. These are just things that I find helpful.
These are not paid endorsements.
And just because it doesn't mean I agree with every word in it either.
Okay.
But a book that I've found to be really popular is this Tactics by Kukul. And one of the things he does is he talks about having how to encourage people to have spiritual conversations. And he talks a lot about like through questions, trying to guide a conversation. And this has been, I almost took it out of one of my classes because I had kind of sensed a negative response, but I thought it was it ended up being more of a squeaky wheel that didn't like arguing, but everybody else was like, we love tactics, of really kind of, again, how to shape conversations. And so it's not like I have to have all this knowledge, but really it's just engaging another person and asking about that. Now he does talk about, like, again, we want to, it's not just about winning the argument, we want to win the person, right?
Yeah.
But he says this guy debates a lot of people, and sometimes he talks about like ricochet evangelism. Like sometimes, if he's in a debate with, and it could be tense, whatever, he says, well, I'm also concerned about the listeners, right? And I want to, it may bounce off them, but how does it ricochet in that way? So that's a really good one. Another book.
Okay, that's called Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions.
Yes, by Gregory Kukul.
Gregory Kukul, Koukl. I'm going to have links to these in the show notes.
Okay, this other one that I just came out like a year and a half ago is called Telling a Better Story. Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age by Joshua D. Chatra. I actually came across him through a textbook on apologetics. It was like cross-shaped apologetics, something like that. But one of the things that he talks about in that book, he gives this idea, this method of inside out. He calls it inside out method, where you want to try to start within another, I'm kind of jumping subjects here about how to talk to others, but you start inside somebody's framework, like where they're at, right? You find what are some of those tensions that you may need to point out. What are things that we can affirm, right? So I'm not always criticizing. What are some things that we can affirm? And then what do we need to do to try to better align them out with the gospel, right? So again, it's just that common sense. Start where somebody is and move outward. And so that becomes kind of like a little bit of a scaffolding, to use a fancy word. Scaffolding to kind of think about what can we affirm? What do we need to challenge? How do we point them out to the gospel? How do we show that Christianity provides a better answer, right? And it's remaining gospel-centered and other-centered approach. Okay. So again, now as Christians, we want to say, well, it's not just a better story, but we will say it's a better story because it's a true story that's connected to the world. But those are two kind of helpful books there.
I think sometimes we overcorrect, right? Or we exaggerate our response because maybe we're surprised that someone would be maybe so open-minded to entertain the notion of X, Y, or Z, whether it's one of these more contemporary issues or a contemporary slant on an old issue. Anyway, maybe they all fall under that second distinction. And so preachers think, okay, preach the word in season, out of season. And we sort of go on the attack mode with that. And maybe we think, well, this person was raised in the church, as we say, or their family has taught them better than this. To some degree, maybe you have an advantage as a college professor because you're getting these people in. They don't have the baggage associated with you. Don't have baggage associated with them, and you're a fresh person to them. They can sort of reinvent themselves almost if they wish. They're in an environment that's conducive to that. I'm just thinking that as preachers, we need to be more and more aware that we need to show our work more, and especially as the up and coming generations up and come. You know what I'm saying? Like, I've found in my ministry, I'm going to paint with some broad brushes. Please don't get mad at me and send me angry emails. Generations about grandparents' age or great grandparents, as the millennials are coming up more, were deeply rooted in Scripture and have a pretty solid foundation, at least doctrinal foundation. It could be that maybe they lean more toward doctrine than maybe love and grace and mercy. Those things don't have to be polar opposites from one another, biblically speaking. But anyway, I'm just talking colloquially here for a moment.
Right.
And but they were committed. They're Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, every Bible class, VBS, gospel meeting kind of people. Their children, who are either the current parent generation or maybe grandparent generation, were a little less convicted. They are kind of there because their mom and dad expect them to be. And when mom and dad pass, they're not as regular anymore. And then their kids are the ones that are maybe now millennials or Gen Zs that are coming into your classroom or have recently graduated. And so with that background in mind, okay, yeah, you were raised here. Maybe you've heard, maybe these 18-year-olds to 22-year-olds have heard these sermons that you've preached when they've been in, hearing your sermons, but they don't often have the conviction in terms of a family raising them in those ways. I mean, I'm painting with really broad brushes here, but I've seen this so much that it sort of makes me, I can see this from a variety of perspectives and a variety of geographic locations. It seems like this is happening all over. In addition to that, we're living in a culture that is a fact-check culture and social media culture, and we all know what everybody believes. And I grew up, you didn't really tell people who you vote for. Now we know all of that information about people we don't even know that well. So with all of that in mind, I mean, I'm just thinking, preachers, we need to, preach the word and be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort. But don't forget the last part, with all long-suffering and teaching. So, to your point about 1 Peter 3 and 2 Corinthians 5 and those other, Colossians chapter 4, I mean, it's right there in 2 Timothy 4 as well. And these things can help us to do that. So anyway, I'm going to step off my soapbox now.
No. Well,
I think this is an important thing to say out loud on a preacher show.
And I think that's, again, I think the importance of an intergenerational church, right? Because, it can be easy to separate, right? Out at the groups, and we do that a lot of times in Bible classes. We do that growing up, and then it's like we keep that trajectory. But I really think there's something to be said for finding those connections, and that's one of the focuses that I'm trying to have in our campus ministry is connecting the college students to our church, to our members, and what they can gain from that, because I think there's insights from each side to be had. But I agree with you. I mean, I think really, we've got to, I mean, it's the same thing we say over and over, but we've got to be in the Word. Like we need to raise a generation that hungers and thirsts for the Word. Right. And then if they have that plus their gentleness and respect, well, some do that well, some are just, again, it's hard to like generalize, because obviously it's all mixed up there together.
I think it's a maturity thing, though. I mean, it's great to be convicted. We have to be convicted. I mean, that's not a negotiable thing. But to learn, wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I mean, there's got to be something to that, right?
Well, it kind of makes me chuckle because I think of like my sixth grade self on the back of the bus. Right. I mean, I was convicted, and I was going to like
judging everybody.
Yeah. And
all these people are wrong.
And so it's like, there's a few folks that I've apologized to in that regard of, again, it's not about just winning an argument. You want to win the person.
It makes me think of some of my first sermons. Because there is this generation that really respects the, as we call them, hellfire and brimstone sermons. Nothing wrong with that. There's a time and a place for it.
Yeah.
Right? But knowing the time and the place is the key point.
Well, actually, I've got a couple other things I was thinking about that I wanted to share with you. So there's an article by, I think it's Andy Crouch. I wrote down, So Andy Crouch, and he talks about postures towards culture.
Oh.
And so he gives a couple of, I guess it's alliteration here. It's condemning, critiquing, consuming, and copying.
Okay.
But so basically he says like, okay, so we take on a posture and it can become, we don't just want to get stuck in one way. So if we're always like, we must, like, there's time to condemn culture, right?
Yeah,
I mean, absolutely.
right.
I'm not saying not condemn, but sometimes we must, but that's not the only thing that we do, right? It's
Yes.
not, so we can't just be stuck in just this condemning mode. Now also critiquing, talks about critiquing, kind of like we're doing right now, right? We're critiquing in a lot of ways. But again, if this is all that we do, then we become more passive in that instead of having something to offer if all we're doing is critiquing, right? Now,
because it's really easy to expose a sin, but then to show all scripture is given by inspiration of God, profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness.
Right.
The instruction in righteousness can be the difficult, the thing that we overlook sometimes in sermons and
offering
classes.
something positive to rebuild, right?
There's hope. Yeah.
And then when consuming, he says, well, look, I mean, if you just consume your culture, you just become part of it, right? And just mindlessly consume it. And then he says copying, that if we're copying, we're always a step behind, right? Just a derivative. So we're taking something and we're going to Christianize it. Now, sometimes we can do some of those things really well, right? But he comes away talking about if we could be, why not be creators and cultivators? So I like that encouragement there. Try to nourish what's best. So instead of not get stuck in just condemning or critiquing or consuming or copying, but how can we cultivate and create? One other person that I found helpful, I didn't bring the book, but it's like Wisdom from Babylon, Gordon T. Smith.
Yeah.
There's a chapter in there, I think you might have it somewhere here. There's a chapter in there where he talks about 4 responses to culture. So the go along to get along, which is not, we want to live peacefully with all as much as we can, know, but if you just blend in and you become it, kind of like consuming culture.
Yeah.
He talks about monastic response. So where you're kind of withdraw and circle the wagons. Culture wars, right? Where it's about who we get into our political positions and, and so again, there's a time and place. There's things from each of these, right? We do want to get along as best we can, but we don't want to compromise.
Yeah.
And I think the monastic response, one of the things, across the street at Freed talk about, like, I say, well, here's the thing. Somebody might say, well, why do you want to go to college? You're just like in a bubble, like you're going to be in a bubble and you're not. Well, what if this formative time in your life, what if we can strengthen you and sink your roots down deep and then launch you out into the world? So for me, I think, okay, if somebody wants to say, well, that's, in a bubble. Okay. Well, yeah, but we're not keeping them in a bubble forever. Like we want them out to transform the world by, sharing the gospel. And so I think, there's a time and place. And again, there's times to have a stake in the culture wars, but if that's all you're doing, then you're missing something. So he talks about, I think he calls it transformative presence. And I like that idea of how we can, be in the world, not of the world, and have that kind of presence. So
Smith talks about a transformative presence. Tell me again, Andy Crouch talks about creating and what was the
cultivating
other? And cultivating. All right. So I'm not just following the news cycle. Is that what he's saying? I mean, if I'm getting down to brass tacks with this, it's not just about reacting to everything that comes up.
Right.
How do you do that? How do you be more proactive, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, what are the things that we can like to get ahead of?
Yeah.
I think like first off, we can be behind.
Yeah.
Right. So to like what I'm trying to do in my contemporary concerns class is get them like up to speed and get a lay of the land. So then they can then find their ways to want to do that. Like,
and sometimes we're just in denial that our culture is going where it's going.
Right.
So, I mean, and this can be a little bit geographic, I guess, I mean, we live in a small town and, big city life maybe will catch up with us. And it used to be like 20 years. Now with the internet, it may be less than that, but, it does take a little less time. I've just found, I don't know if this is what Crouch is getting at or not, or even Smith, but, when you just preach expository sermons, relevant stuff just comes up. It's just there. you know, and it's not reactionary. It's like, well, I'm not. And hey, listen, if you preached on, you know, the sanctity of human life recently in light of, you know, over the summer in light of the Supreme Court decision, you know, that struck down Roe v. Wade, hey, I think that's appropriate to do. Hey, not that long ago, I showed pictures from the James Webb Telescope and tried to use that as a motivation for worship. I don't think that's reactionary so much as just this is on everybody's minds. On the other side of that, though, if all I'm ever doing is just like watching these news sites and taking down the headlines and then getting up and preaching that, after a while, that's just kind of discouraging. It's like, man, if I wanted sermon content from the 24/7 news cycle, I'll just go watch Fox News or CNN all the time. You know, I mean,
well, you know, you ask about cultivating.
Yeah.
Like this is what came to mind, and this would be, you know, a controversial, potentially controversial statement for some. Probably, maybe not. I don't want to assume anything about our listeners, about your listeners, but you know, in the world, if I were to just go out there, I'm sure there are people who won't beat me on that. But like, for example, like I am not a fan of social justice, as in capitalized social justice, social just like academic, critical race theory. And I have my reasons why that I can explain. That's another podcast for another time. Right. But I have a problem with the philosophical underpinnings of it. And that I think it clashes with the gospel message, but I'm against capital social justice because I want to be for biblical social justice, right? Yeah. And so a lot of times we use these same words, but we're talking about different things. And so how can I cultivate, instead of being somebody that just criticizes or like, well, I didn't vote for him because I heard critical race theory, or, you know, and then they're seen as, well, you just are just sitting in your pew and just isolating yourself. How can I cultivate and create and be a positive voice for what we should be about doing in biblical social justice? Yeah. It's in a way, it's not letting, again, it's kind of competing definitions in a sense of really kind of clarifying what we need to be about. Because if the younger generation, which is for social justice, I mean, I think biblical social justice, but if we let the culture be the only ones who define that and kind of take the term, then there becomes confusion about what we really ought to be about. So
it's less buzzwords and more concepts,
right?
Kind of thing.
And how can we cultivate positive concept of those things that make a difference, so that if somebody from the outside, you know, like I said, well, I'm against like critical race theory for some, you know, academic philosophical reasons that kind of clash with biblical things, but somebody doesn't say, well, he's just gonna, but that's somebody who cares about the poor, and the on the fringe and the, you know, so anyways, I think that's another way to think about cultivating.
Good. And that would be a way that maybe we can help. If I'm going back to sort of the generational gap thing that where we began some time ago, we can help to bridge that gap a little bit by maybe I can familiarize myself with some of these terms that are very much in the common vernacular of the younger generations. They see some merit to at least the nugget of some of those concepts, but I can help to bring it into more of a gospel-focused concept by helping them redefine maybe a little bit, speaking their language a little more. Right. Yeah. Okay. I've got one more question here as we sort of transition to the end, and I want to know what you want to say to younger Christians who are on the front lines in some of these discussions. Is there anything else we need to say before we shift gears to there? We've kind of been talking to preachers so far in this. I mean, have we overlooked anything? We got way off our notes there for a moment. Sorry. I'm sorry about that. Was my fault. But I'm supposed to be driving the ship, and I'm not at all. Okay, very good. Let me take a quick break, and then when we come back, I want to talk about younger Christians who are on the front lines in some of these and what you might want to say to those people. Just remind all of you who are listening or watching that Preachers in Training is brought to you by the Light Network, a network of podcasts designed to encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, empower your faith. TheLightNetwork.tv is the website, and that's where you can also incidentally find all of our episode archives. 15 previous seasons, and now we've officially launched the 16th season. Go check them out. Next year, 2023, is our 10th year at the Light Network. We got some big plans, and it'll incidentally be the 10th year of Preachers in Training because this was one of the original shows. So be watching that website for that. We'd love for you to go and check out some of those previous archived episodes. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'd love to hear from you. Preachers at thelightnetwork.tv is how you can get in touch with me. And we also have a Facebook group. Just search Facebook for Preachers in Training. It's a closed group because we like to keep the conversation on task. But it's a great place. People type in there and say, hey, what resources do you have about this? Or how do you follow up with guests who visit with you on Sundays or whatever? It's a great place for us to just sort of think together and swap ideas and recommendations and stuff like that. If you enjoy the podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube if you prefer to see our lovely faces. Soko's wearing a beautiful shirt today, and, we want to make sure that you can check that out. Subscribe so you never miss an episode. Brand new episodes are released every Thursday from thelightnetwork.tv and our podcast partners. And thanks for listening to Preachers in Training. We're talking on Season 16, Episode 1 about contemporary issues, contemporary concerns with our resident here at Henderson campus minister and also associate professor of Bible and Humanities at Freed-Hardeman University, Matthew Sokoloski. Let's talk to the younger Christians a minute. We've been talking to preachers. Maybe we've been trying to give some thoughts, how do we need to address this sort of stuff? But if you're talking to a younger Christian who's on the front lines of these discussions, or maybe even a young preacher, brand new at this, what do you want to say to these people?
I think I just want for young Christians to know, look, the tension that you feel, I think is natural because we live in a cultural setting, and again, people all over the world, whatever culture that they're in, and it's like the air that we breathe, it's the water that we swim in. I'm trying to remember where this quote was from. It might be from Os Guinness in his book, The Call. I feel like maybe there's a chapter in there somewhere, but he says something along the lines of even a dead body floats downstream.
No, I know that's graphic.
I know. Perfect thing. We would ever recap this.
Yeah.
But the idea is that I think about a river. If we think about our culture, right, the way of the world is it wants to carry us off.
Yeah.
And so we got to swim upstream, and we're going to feel that tension. And sometimes we're going to get dragged back, but how do we keep fighting a good fight? And I think what we need to do is make sure that we go to God and his word, and use that to define our terms and things like that. Right. Because I think really kind of going back to what I talked about earlier, Chatra's book, Telling About Her Story, is that we want to say the Christian message, the gospel is good news. It's a message of reconciliation that we get to be ambassadors for. And so, there will be, Jesus told us that there will be people that hate us, right? Even we can do it in all the best way. But we anchor to that and just remind ourselves when we get down or pessimistic or feel like, everything's going the wrong direction, that again, every generation is going to struggle with this. And so I think it's just remaining anchored to God and being that salt and that light and being that ambassador. And just a reminder, because the world wants to say, oh, well, you're closed-minded or you're bigoted or you're just judgy and condemning. This is something that I've said multiple times, that when Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and nobody comes to the Father but through me, that's very exclusive. It's Jesus, right? And the world would be like, well, how arrogant are you to claim to know? These are the words of my Savior, and I'm a follower of Jesus. But that exclusive message is an inclusive invitation to all, that all are invited. And so I think sometimes, these things that we argue about, kind of flipping it to again, twist the positive of how Christ offers something better, that all the things that the world offers are counterfeits.
Oh, yeah.
Or, I think Satan takes things that are good and twists them and distorts them. And so these things that the culture is saying on the surface appear, like a positive thing, right? Here's another contrast. Love is love, right?
Yeah.
Let's go back to who is the originator of love and look to God. And so that we are for love. In fact, we have a message of love and reconciliation.
Yeah.
And so I think not letting the world take and redefine all these things, and I think we've got to be anchored to God in that regard and think creatively of how we can reach to those that are, maybe going downstream and we want to grab them and say, swim upstream with me,
Yeah. And I'm thinking, just like it's important for me to understand, like what does social justice mean in a contemporary vernacular, right? What's that definition? And I have to understand that before I can even formulate my own concept of whether I agree or not. I need to do the same thing with biblical concepts. And it could be that even if I was raised, hearing these terms, I may not really understand the kind of all-encapsulating perfect love that God embodies and has. And I may not understand redemption or reconciliation or forgiveness or any of these concepts. And I think sometimes too, we do ourselves a disservice because we think, I know what that stuff means. Or we let a poor example of a Christian somehow like define those concepts for us. And we think, well, if that's what that is, then I don't want that.
Right.
We're not going back to the word, to your point.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, I know you've got a few more books over there. Do you want to share? Some of those just as recommendations if you're looking for some reading?
So these are, I'm always looking for some good books. And so again, as I recommend these, I find them that there's some valuable things in them. Again, that doesn't mean that I agree or you would agree with every single thing.
Eat the meat, spit out the bones.
Exactly. So this just came out a couple months ago. This is called The Secular Creed, Engaging 5 Contemporary Claims by Rebecca McLaughlin. This is put out by the Gospel Coalition, which I think is a group of Reformed folks. But here are the chapters, and here's why I think it's relevant to our discussion about contemporary concerns. Black Lives Matter, Love is Love, the gay rights movement is the new civil rights movement, women's rights are human rights, transgender women are women.
Wow.
So I'm going to try this book out with one of my classes because it's thinking about engaging these things that are held up, as these core values. And how can we engage with them from a Christian perspective?
Yeah.
Okay, another one that I think is really great is called Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution by Carl Trueman. I think that sexual ethics is a huge topic that is going on in our culture at large, and so we need to talk about it with Christians of all ages of how to engage this.
Yeah.
He actually wrote a book a couple years that came out that was The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Yeah.
This is like a more popular level treatment of it. And so this really is helpful. I think he initially he starts out by saying how is it that this makes sense? Like I am a woman trapped in a man's body or vice versa, right? How did we get to the point where that's normal as we think about transgenderism and all that going on in the world? So Strange New World is a great way to kind of get a lay of the land and kind of see how we've gotten to where we are.
Yeah.
That this dramatic shift that we've seen in the last decade, 2 decades in sexual ethics, those seeds were planted long before. Okay, another one that I really like. Now, if you're interested in some of the things that have shaped some of my thinking about how to engage critical race theory, it's Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. How activist scholarship made everything about race, gender, and identity, and why this harms everybody.
Wow.
Now, the reason why I like this book, there was another book that I tried, and it was one of those things that I feel like it was preaching the choir, and it wouldn't have convinced anybody outside of, it wouldn't convince somebody to change their view either way, really.
Yeah.
And maybe oversimplified some cases. The thing of Cynical Theories is a bit of a deeper read, but what I like about it is it's looking at the philosophical underpinnings of activist scholarship and contrasting that with philosophical liberalism. And I think that's a good way to kind of engage somebody that may be coming not from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
And by philosophical liberalism, I'll just say this because you can get the book if you want to read it. Like I tell my students now, if you're like, well, no, I'm a conservative. Well, you're a liberal in this sense of philosophical liberalism. Like, we uphold freedom and, rights and things like that.
Yeah.
And so anyways, that's a good book. The last one I just read a month or two ago, it just came out, Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times by Jonathan Sacks. Now, Jonathan Sacks just actually died, I think within the last 6 months. He says Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. And I don't want to take too long, but I just want to give you some of the chapters in here. So a section on the solitary self, unsocial media, the limits of self-help, loneliness, the fragile family. When he talks about the market and the state, he talks about consuming happiness, democracy in danger, identity politics, he has a section on can we still reason together? And here's some of the chapters: post-truth, safe space, victimhood, the return of public shaming, the death of civility. And so, I mean, that's very current in engaging a lot of it. And it came out, and the post-word or whatever was right after the pandemic. He wrote it came out right as we were moving in the pandemic. Now he's going to have some different views on probably morality. I think anyways, all that to say that the very last section, probably a lot of, as with me, and a lot of your listeners probably will disagree with him there, but it is interesting from a theist perspective to even read some of those things of how he accounts. He probably gives he probably accepts like a theistic evolution kind of view. It's interesting to hear somebody who believes in God. Now, he doesn't really give an argument for the development of morality, but he offers an explanation of how that would be the case.
Okay.
So that's in my opinion, it can be helpful to read to see that perspective, but the beginning stuff I think is some of that really good stuff to think about in our time. So there's a nice little stack of reading. Again, that might be helpful in pointing to some other things.
Yeah, super helpful. Hey, wow, thanks for this. This has been really good. I appreciate the discussion and all your preparation, too. It's been great.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's been good to be here. I hope it was helpful. I hope it helps some folks out there that are listening.
I think it will. Yeah. Hey, that's going to do it for this edition of Preachers in Training. Join us next week when Dr. Milton Sewell is on the podcast to talk about ministering to your wife and with your wife. A lot of great marriage helps there and some good practical stuff coming up on that edition. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks for being with us. Let's go preach the word.